Hey everybody, this is Isaiah and welcome back to Magic System Monday. And today I want to talk about how to avoid something I refer to as a threat cost. Now generally speaking, when you're writing, a lot of writers like to add certain limitations to their power systems, but sometimes people like to take it a step further and add inherent risks or drawbacks to having or even using a certain power. For example, when someone first awakens the Mangekyo Sharingan, if they overuse that power, they will go blind and lose access to their Sharingan capabilities. On the other hand, there are also powers like Devil Fruit in One Piece, where once you gain those powers, regardless of whether or not you ever bother using them, you will permanently lose your ability to swim in water. So regardless of whether or not it's a drawback of using that power or even having it to begin with, they're designed to add tension and risk to the story, to make us worry about these characters. But sometimes, writers don't always use them that well, and that's when we get what we refer to as a threat cost. To make it as simple as possible, a threat cost is a type of dramatic cost that is either so strong or so powerful or so story warping that the writers either refuse to use it or give characters copious amounts of plot armor to get around it. Sometimes, they'll even change the context of that cost. Oftentimes, writers will try to fool you by convincing you these costs matter when they really don't. For example, they'll only use them on characters that were either going to die anyway, or they use it to pick off characters that aren't important to the story anymore. So ultimately, threat costs are costs that are poorly utilized by the writer, to the point where their true value never comes to fruition. And if you read or watch a lot of different works of fiction, you can often see exactly where things are going. You can see that you don't have to be worried about certain characters because the writer's gonna hold off on allowing these consequences to affect them. Now, saying all that begs a bit of a question, doesn't it? And that would be, how do we write dramatic cost in such a way that we can prevent it from becoming a threat cost? And I think I have a few answers that might satisfy that question. Now, the first thing you want to do initially is reevaluate your choices. I've noticed over my years of being a writer, even before I became Magic System Monday, that a lot of people have the issue of feeling as though they need to have some type of dramatic cost. I, in the past, have showed people my work on the internet before, and I've had people criticize or critique my work for not having enough quote-unquote cost or dramatic cost, which I always found funny. Because dramatic cost is not something you need for every story. In fact, in my experience, when I see writers that are absolutely bent on making sure their story has dramatic cost, very rarely is it used properly, and oftentimes it simply gets in the way of the story they were trying to tell, if not also adding some form of redundance. I've noticed a lot of writers, for some reason, like to write power systems where if a character uses too much energy, they'll die, which has always been very weird to me. The idea isn't inherently unreasonable, but if you pay attention, in a lot of these situations where characters die from overusing powers, in a lot of those situations they could have simply died anyway because they were at the end of their rope. So dying from energy use or dying from exhaustion in a lot of cases isn't really helpful to the story, although there are probably some outliers. But I say all that to say this: do you really want a cost in your story? If you discover that the answer is yes, then that's okay. Let's proceed with the video. One of the easy ways to prevent something from becoming a threat cost is to recognize the negative correlation between the growing risk of using a power and a writer's desire to actually allow that risk to come to fruition. To put it more simply, the more dramatic, the more extreme that cost is, the less likely a writer's going to actually allow that character to face it. Why? Well, for the same reasons we mentioned in the other videos. Because it'll warp the story more than they want it to. So as a result, they avoid it. But if it wasn't as dramatic, if it wasn't as extreme or story warping, you wouldn't have this problem. And you'd have much more incentive to use it without having the fear of it destroying the story. If you dial it back, instead of cranking everything up to 11 all the time and going, oh, if they use the power, their head will explode, oh my goodness. You could instead so make it that the drawback is something less strenuous but also still temporarily debilitating. And that's my cue to talk about One Piece. Now, if you know One Piece, then you'll know one of the most interesting pieces of that world are devil fruits. Devil fruits are these miraculous fruit that, if someone is to take a bite out of them, will gain a special power, and while those powers vary, any person who consumes a devil fruit permanently loses their ability to swim in water. If they fall in water, they'll sink to the bottom, and they can't move. Now, devil fruit users being weak to the sea is supposed to be the premier drawback or the premier limitation that characters exhibit in One Piece. That regardless of how powerful a devil fruit user is, if they take the dip, it's game over. Unless someone jumps in the water to pull them out who doesn't have a devil fruit. And this, as a result, is probably one of the biggest expressions of plot armor that a character can exhibit throughout the entire series to my knowledge. A lot of these devil fruit users are very special, and it would be a massive waste if one of them died by taking a dip in the water. In fact, in my research, I couldn't help but notice that not a single character has died yet from falling in the water with a devil fruit. Luffy himself, the main character, has fallen in a number of times, and the writer employs copious amounts of plot armor to get him out of that situation, and this is all because he made the critical mistake of trying to crank the risk up to 11. What if instead this drawback was kind of peeled back a little bit? Instead of a person with a devil fruit not being able to move and simply sinking to the bottom of water, what if it was like a watered down kryptonite to them? What if instead their movements became more sluggish and their powers were weakened? Then all of a sudden there are risks, but it's not as strenuous. But let's also adjust another detail. Now, as you know, you have to be submerged to a certain extent before the weakness of devil fruits begins to take place. Well, what if we lower that requirement? What if it takes less water, and maybe even say the more submerged you are, the more the weakness takes place? So even if you were so much as ankle deep in water, you would still take some of the drawback, just not as much. But if you were completely submerged, it would be much more debilitating, but you still theoretically could move. Now, all of a sudden, we can be much more flexible with our devil fruit users. Some people might call me out here and say, but Isaiah, are you saying we should take away the risk of the sea? That's one of the biggest defining factors in One Piece, right? That's simply the burden that they have to bear. I'm not saying take it away, but if you simply watered it down a little bit, then the writer could use it much more fluidly. We'd probably have many more circumstances where characters either fell in the water or were partially submerged in the water, and then we could use that to create even more risk and conflict than the writer had before. Because if Luffy falls in the water before the story is over, we know he's coming back out of it. You see what I'm saying? But now instead of saying, oh, how are we going to save him from the water? Now we say, oh, how does him being nerfed to this extent affect the fight? But you can also do it with other characters like villains. I couldn't help but notice that certain characters like Usopp are very limited in terms of their opportunities to shine. Characters being weakened by some allotment of seawater could end up being the solution for having characters like Usopp actually be useful. Perhaps there's a really strong devil fruit user that Usopp would never be able to beat on his own, but now that he's slightly injured and he's knee-deep in water, maybe Usopp actually has a chance because his reaction times are slowed, or maybe his power doesn't reach as far as it should normally in water. And it's not as if characters are now exempt from dying in the water. For example, if a devil fruit user was injured and fell in the water, maybe it's actually game over for them then. Maybe if they got caught in a current that was too strong, they wouldn't be able to resist it because they were weakened as much. And you can still effectively have the exact same costs and risks, but with extra, just by weakening the drawback. The weaker the drawback is, the more willing a writer will be to use it, and the easier it will be to do that. To make matters even more extreme, you could also use this for salty runbacks. You could have a character who is grown in strength significantly to the point where some of their rivals are no longer relevant. You can have that character in a temporarily nerfed state just for us to see how far they've grown as characters, going back up against those previous rivals that they either struggled against or were roughly evenly matched for, and seeing how well they do now. You could even have situations like, those big fish they have in One Piece? There are a lot of characters that are strong enough to take those things out on their own, but what if those characters have devil fruits and fall on the water? Well, all of a sudden, not only are they out of their element, but the fish are in their element. They'll have the home field advantage on top of the character being weakened. Now we can have all these dynamic circumstances. We can utilize the same thing, not only in One Piece, but also in your writing. If you dial the weakness back, and allow its use to become more fluid, you can get not only the exact same utility out of it, but you can also get way more. But I know what you're thinking. Isaiah, what if this doesn't really satisfy me? What if this doesn't scratch that itch that I had? The reason I had characters risk death when they use their powers? I just wanted something that strong. What you're suggesting to me now does not have that kick. What should I do then? Well, this is the part where I bring up the fact that variation is key. It is the context of all of the different colors in the rainbow that gives each and every one of them their value. And you can utilize that in your world building as well. Because in your story, perhaps some powers have this type of risk and some powers have that type of risk. Not all of the powers have to have the exact same level of risk or drawback. You can utilize watered down forms of risks for some types of powers and then use extreme ones for others. But in my experience, what I've noticed is that the more extreme a cost is, the less common it should be. If someone is risking death to use a power, this is something that should not come up all that often. Because if it does, writers will get burnt out of that cost. Even if they think in their heads that it's theoretically a big deal, whether it's conscious or unconscious, they will know that if it keeps coming up, especially if it's a main character, you're not gonna just kill that character. So the more sparingly you use that, the better it will be. And in the meantime, in those gaps of times where you don't want to use the most dramatic form of cost you can possibly muster, you can use the watered down ones. And as I mentioned earlier with Usopp, this will also allow you the opportunity to flesh out your side characters. Now all of a sudden, if the main character is debilitated temporarily from their ability, now you've got characters that are not necessarily as useful or as strong as them that have to step up. And this interacts with something I mentioned before in a previous video. The title of the video was Stop Ditching Your Main Characters. And the issue I had in that video was a lot of writers have issues spreading out investment to their different characters, and once they realize that they haven't developed their side cast, they'll kind of throw the main character away for a while to try to spend all this time developing their side characters. And sometimes viewers who really cared about that main character have a tendency of losing investment. Well, ironically, we can solve one problem with another here. If instead of just having a character under the risk of death, we say, well, that character's going to be down and out for a while. That character's going to be heavily nerfed for a little while. Then what? Now all of a sudden, you have a very natural reason or justification for side characters who typically aren't in the spotlight to step up and do something. Well, folks, that's all I've got for today. There might be more solutions that we can implement that we can talk about at a later date, but I'm not super comfortable with trying to edit a video that's as long as the one I'm looking at right now. Some solutions are more nuanced and are more tailored to your exact circumstances as a writer, not only when it comes to what types of writing suits you best, but the actual details of the work of fiction in question. But if you made it this far, let me know if you think I should make a Magic System Monday Discord server. I'm thinking about giving it a test, maybe making one and leaving it up for maybe a month or so, just to see how things go, but I'm not exactly sure. Give me your opinions in the comments section. But in the meantime, you know exactly where to find me. I'm here on YouTube, I read as many comments as I possibly can, and I'm also on Reddit by the same name. You can probably get a hold of me there. I frequent Character Rant, r/writing, and r/magic building and world building. Until next time, this is Isaiah from Magic System Monday, and I'll see you guys later.